jako filozoficzne metafory ukryte w szlagierach popkultury. Zapraszam.
And this is too loud, I guess. I will try to speak without this. Okay, so I will use this. And I would like to speak in English rather, because I do not agree to translate the word fairy stories to Polish in any possible way. Is it okay for you? Yeah, it is. So I wanted to speak about the human and elvish magic, like more general, but since I got engaged for the third time in reading the Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, I changed the topic a little bit, and I want to raise a discussion about the essay. So I will concentrate on fairy stories, and the question of what is magic, what can be elfish and human magic, we can get from the fairy stories, because that is especially Tolkien's approach to the questions of what is magic and enchantment and spells, is that we cannot define it in terms of our reality. We have to define the realm of fairies, the fairyland, or the land of elves, where the stories, including magic, are happening, to understand what the magic is. And actually, I will give you a short example of like what language he uses. I propose to speak about fairy stories, though I am aware that this is a rash adventure. Fairy is a perilous land, and in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. So he's speaking very in a very narrative and personal language, and also admits that there is no definition, because we cannot put in normal scientific terms what the fairyland is. We rather have to venture there on our own and exchange our experience in the fairyland. So to understand what a fairy story is, we have to go for a little journey to the realm of where the fairies live. Because like when you look in the encyclopedia or dictionary, fairy story should be a story including some fairies or elves. Usually mostly fairies are elves, but also dwarves or giants, that are like one supernatural, two usually of very, very small, which is Tolkien does not agree with, because they can be small, but they can be extremely large, and they can be changing shifting their shapes, one's being small, one being large. And Tolkien also doesn't agree with fairies being supernatural. He would rather say that fairies are natural because they are connected to the nature, and humans are supernatural because they are changing the nature. So to define what are the fairies or what are the elves, he says us that we cannot look into any definition, but we have to go to their land and catch a glimpse of how they're behaving. And what are the fairies and what are the fairy stories? Let's start from the negative approach. We would, because we cannot get it that every story that there is an elf or a dwarf in the story is already a fairy tale, and on the other hand, we cannot say that, okay, it is not a fairy tale because there are no elves, no dwarves included. A fairy tale, first of all, is not a traveler's story. So, for example, Gulliver and his travels to the land of like extra small people would not be a fairy story, because there are many travelers, wanderers tale, even to the like depths of the seas or to some trips to the moon. But a travel that is going inside our universe, inside our reality, though very, very far in space, sometimes very far in time, but let's say a time machine. A story that is still inside the borders of our world is a traveler's story, and the fairy story is a story about a different universe, about the other world that is not inside the borders of our space and time. Secondly, a fairy story should not be confused with a dream diary. Fairy stories or ventures to the realm of fairies are not reported dreams, are not something that is subjectively happening to our mind when the consciousness is off and we are sleeping. We can write a diary about what we have dreamt of, but this is not a fairy story, because in a dream everything can happen, and we do not have to explain, or we do not have to keep that this is true, while in the fairy story what is happening inside the story has kind of innate inner consistency of reality. That's inside the story, the elves are true, the spells and the enchantments are true. It's just not that I dreamt or something and it happened that way. Thirdly, a fairy story is not to be confused with beast tales. So little stories, usually for children, or some moral allegories concerning animals speaking, usually showing some types of human characters, like Aesop fables, or a story that a shark captured a monkey to eat its heart, but later the monkey told him that its heart it's hidden on the island, on the bush hanging on a tree, so the shark has to give the monkey back to the land. And so like when the animals are playing humans just under the cover, or a fox being super smart, or a sheep being kind of clumsy, these are beast fables, not to be confused with fairy tales. And fourth, to say what a fairy story is by Tolkien, it should not be confused with, as he tells it, the nature myths. Tolkien was writing his essays in 40s and 50s when still for example, Greek mythology and the gods living on Olympus were interpreted to be like personified forces of nature. So Zeus is a kind of thunder and storm with a human face, and these are not fairy tales, but this is not also a way to interpret ancient mythology according to Tolkien. That is true that fairy stories are coming from very ancient times. We cannot really trace the origin of fairy stories, as only few of them survived. Usually they are written down in 19th century and adjusted by the writers to the nowadays society that is able to read it. We do not really know what the ancient writers and storytellers wanted to say. We do not really know that they were a kind of primitive or like scared of everything that is happening in the nature and just trying to add a human face to make it like a little bit rational for them. A fairy story is not to interpret the reality, which we cannot do by science because we have no science, so we make a story of it. Fairy story can be as well written and performed, according to Tolkien, by modern people who have the science and still are writing and reading fairy stories, which just are fulfilling totally different needs and desires of a human being. And fifth of all, and on this point I will stop for a while, a fairy story is not and should not be a nursery tale. which means something adjusted for the kids. Tolkien writes it in a very funny language that it is, the people tend to think that fairy stories and all the stories about elves and dwarves are connected to children's mind in the same way that milk is connected to their body. And you know, the Grimm fables were written in a more direct, maybe violent way, and later switched, were adjusted for the for children to be like, they cut out the violent scenes, and this is just putting all the ancient mythology, fairy tales that are and should be for adult people into the nursery. So we do not really take it seriously, but we will tell it to the children, and it's okay. He writes that for Tolkien, the fairy tale, that children are not more like wanting to hear fairy tales. They do not understand it better than adults, and the need of fairy tales is not declining while we are growing up. On the contrary, fairy tales are mainly for adults. And if we put the fairy tales into the nursery, just we give it to the children, that could be out of the adult sentiment, like imagining, I'm not a kid anymore, but I would like to be, so let's pretend that I am able for now to read a fairy tale, and I will pretend to be a little Peter Pan, and I will really enjoy it. Tolkien wonders, why is it so that when an adult is reading a fairy tale, it can be one, he's reading it to his children, or two, he's studying them professionally at some ethnology department, or three, he's pretending to be a Peter Pan and playing a little game, a little sentiment game for himself for just one evening. He wonders, why is it not that just a grown-up adult, fully educated, gives his time to read fairy tales for pleasure. Like, that's what Tolkien did, and maybe that's what he started, because his opinion is set in the end of 40s. Maybe people were not reading fairy tales for pleasure. Maybe that's something that Tolkien introduced to our culture of the end of the 20th century. But let's go to the positive answer, what the fairy story is. I mean, let's ask, what does it give to us, to, let's say, adults who still want to read fairy tales? Why this kind of literature and not another? And Tolkien is writing about few so-called primordial desires that are like inside human beings and are satisfied while reading or writing fairy stories, which are, number one, to survey the depths of space and time. That's what he writes, and to survey the depths of space and time is not only making a science fiction story using some time machine or traveler story to faraway China or some hidden valley where the dinosaurs live. It is to survey the depths, I mean to find the other world. It should always be the other world, and it doesn't have to be extremely far in kilometers or in years. It has to be something different, something like a secondary parallel reality, not a hidden valley that was not discovered by humans yet. And this need of otherness, of experiencing the otherness, is never gone. Like it's something like totally different from the need of mapping and all the world by science and understanding the forces of nature and having all the full geographical information. Tolkien does not intend us to forget about the science. It's just this world that we are understanding in the scientific terms, and the other world that is not fully comprehensible by definitions and reason, which is to be experienced, and this is the second world which we can enter, and I will go there later. But the second primordial desire, to hold communion with other living beings. This we can find also in beast fables, or like in beliefs that during like some special day we can hear or understand the animals talking, understand their language, and need to communicate with other living, reasoning, feeling beings that you can see like in many films and read in many books. Like we've got aliens and we've got elves and we've got everything. The urge to communicate with something that is not human is, according to Tolkien's, inside the people, and we really want to to do that. And fairy tales, or the journeys to the realm of fairy, can satisfy that desire that is already here. And the third, some kind of feel of the need of something concrete or some reality attached, or in the reality inside the sub-creation. For of course a human being is creating art and is creating different worlds of imagination, but there is a need for some inside coherence, so inside force, which we can call it reality, inside the created world. And when there is some inner consistency of reality, when there is something that seems to be independent from the creator, that is still there, why the creator like already forgot, is sleeping or is doing completely something else, this need is inside a human being. Maybe it's underneath like the ancient mythology as well, because the gods on the Olympus mountain should be there also while we are not thinking about them. And this need can be satisfied while we are doing fairy tales. Maybe I should say doing fairy tales or doing fairy stories, because this is a kind of traveling or experiencing. Yeah. After speaking about the desires the fairy stories can fulfill, so I would like to sum up it a bit of what I read and what I find especially interesting in Tolkien's approach, that he really perceived the fairy land, the land where some kind of elves and other human beings reside, as being a secondary world, of course, created by the force of human imagination, but also a world that is existing on its own rights, and being so huge and vast that's never gonna be totally explored by the people who seldom are able to visit, to meet the inhabitants, and to stay there for a little while, stand there for a little while. Why? The people are so-called enchanted. This can be and we can meet with fairies. Fairies are defined by the inhabitants of the fairyland, whom we can meet, but they are not especially interested in us, visitors. We can come there, we can have some communication, but like Tolkien puts it the way, if they really exist, it's also true that they are not primarily interested with humans, and the fates of our people are sundered. The same word that is used in Silmarillion, that the fates of the elves the high and the green elves is sundered, and the fate of the men and the elves is sundered because they experience the death in a totally different way. And what are the elves? How can we define the fairies that are like making a fairy story? The fairy story. I have a proposition to do, and that's also my question. I have some ideas later, but I would like to ask you now, would you like to agree, or have you met with this kind of idea that the elves, there is something that elvish craft, Tolkien was writing about elvish craft, which can be when a human is writing, like a fully detailed and very like inside a life word that has this idea of going on its own rights. Tolkien calls it the elvish craft, according to a writer of the fairy tales. But inside the fairy, the realm of fairies, we can also say that the fairies are doing the elvish craft. And my proposition is that the elves, which, you know, the Tolkien raised them up a little, like from the little funny dwarves to the high elves that we now know in the fantasy genre, that are a little bit higher and a little bit slimmer than humans, and they are usually extra smart and handsome. Yeah? I would consider elves to be non-digital artificial intelligence agents that are living in the created, in the secondary world, which means the world created by the writer's imagination, but after reaching some level of complexity, they can really continue working on and building and constructing the space and times, making bridges over rivers, raising castles, fighting with orcs, and like usually what the elves are doing, like at Tolkien at least. After reaching some level of complexity, they can continue on their own. I don't know if you know a notion that is a question of non-digital artificial intelligence agents. Or do you have any, would you agree with my impression that somebody created a secondary world, draw the maps, wrote the history, calculated the ages, the periods, wrote about their culture, wrote about their books, sketched the genealogical trees of the families of elves, like named the world, the Middle-earth, and Arda, the whole planet. And after reaching this level of like extra detail, like the author died, but the world is still there. Like the kind that I can go there when I read the book, and I'm discovering something that was there. It's not creating subjective images while I'm reading, but I have the feeling that I'm traveling to the world that many people who read this, like read it with caution, maybe 2-3 times, read it like for a long time, that someone also, not only me and the author, have been there before and left their marks. Yeah, that's also a bit worrying for me, because I'm able to read all the Tolkien has written. I'm not sure if I have yet, but it is like for sure possible, but I'm not sure if it's possible to read all the fun fiction going like happening in the Tolkien's world. Maybe one lifetime is not enough to read it all. Maybe it's being written and created more and more, like even faster that I am able to read. Possibly, like I've seen so many stories written in the world, which is very building. I love this, that the idea was continued, and actually the idea to create a mythology for England that Tolkien wrote about, like that he had this idea to build a very important mythology for all the nation because he felt England is lacking one. Later, being old, he refused it, or like admitted that this is just due to his arrogance, and let's settle down on a quite lower goal that is just creating a kind of inside consistent world, not just a mythology for the nation, which could also be dangerous. But actually, I see now that he created a mythology, just not for English nation, but for the world. Like, probably the fantasy genre would be not possible, would be not happening without the Tolkien's writings. But yeah, my question is just of like more ontological nature. I mean, on what terms could we agree on how can we define the self, this inner reality of the fairy land? Because we have some kind of like problems with words in here. Because if something is not objective, as the philosophers used to say, then it's subjective and just a matter of human imagination there. But maybe let's not go inside the technical philosophy, because I still have, I wanted to say, yeah, about the elvish and human magic inside the Tolkien. So, after saying that they are some kind like artificial intelligence agents who are like dwelling on their own and reconstructing and like still creating the world while we are not there, I would like to focus on what kind of magic, what kind of spell, they are not using spells, but what kind of magic are the elves using. And the word is not a spell but enchantment, which is crucial here. And let's put it fast, there are two kinds of magic that we can find in Tolkien's like theory, essays and letters. So let's call them spell and enchantment. Though when he uses the word enchantment, it's always like this elvish craft, while a spell is sometimes in the meaning of like this human or mechanical spell, or sometimes used for enchantment, but let's make it like 0-1 now. We are used to magic like this, I call it the Alohomora kind of magic, which I have a spell, I remember a formula, or I need a kind of powder or poison or potion, and I use it according to the rules, and I'm achieving instant goal and satisfaction, and I'm changing something. I'm changing and transforming the object of my craft, of my magic now. So in kind of there is, of course, it's not mechanical in terms of science, like you are repairing a motorbike, but it's still mechanical in this way that I have this formula, and I'm expecting precisely this effect on that object, and I'm reaching this effect. This is a short-term effect. This is artificial compared to something like more natural. This involves labor and science and does not change the essence of the operator. It changes the properties of the object being operated at. And all the spells, this is maybe like we perceive magic in computer games and a lot of like fantasy movies that somebody's casting a spell. In a lot of games, also when we want to have like maybe love games, which are played according to some mechanics. When we have the mechanics and we are trying to follow the mechanics, there is the mechanic. So this is the kind of short-term artificial spell that reaches his goal in this very world. And compared to this is the magic of the elves. And I realized that, you know, the elves are the magical creatures that are set to use the magic all the time, while actually they are not casting any spells. It would be hard to find a spell in Silmarillion, actually, cast by the elves. I mean that a thunderbolt or like open, okay, let the gate be open. If there is a secret word and Gandalf uses to open the dwarvish gate, then it is a spell. But usually it's that, okay, Galadriel is living in Lothlorien. And because of that, everything is so fine and beautiful that the Hobbit company, once enters it, cannot go out because it's so enchanting, actually. But she never casted a spell. She never knew any formula, never had a magic wand. She's living there. And because she's living there, the trees are growing healthy, the water is clean and tasty, and everything is somehow doing fine. Like Gandalf has a ring, and the Gandalf's company traveling with him is feeling more brave while in his presence, and by the time he's gone, actually the company is split and divided, and they are very confused about what should they do in the nearest future. So comparing to the spells, there is no cause-effect chain that we can trace when we are speaking about the enchantment. The effect, if there is an effect of a spell, it's a long-term, not a short-term effect. It's not, it's usually how Tolkien understands the enchantment, it's connecting to the very nature. It's not usually about raising extra high castles, but living in the shadow of the trees and talking or like communicating somehow, maybe without words, with animals. And this in comparison to casting a spell, which can like in maximum just make me quite tired because I'm lowering down my mana level, like in the games. This involves the very being, the essence of the one who is like enchanting. So it drives the energy from the one who is responsible for the enchantment. And we can guess that while the enchanter is gone, dead or like left away, probably the enchantment would be gone, and that's how it is. Like when Melian leaves the forest of Doriath, the Melian's embrace is no longer there, and everyone can just go straight inside the forest, while before that they were like magically lost in the very beginning of the forest, and nobody could, except Beren, could enter the realm of Doriath. So these are totally different kinds of spells. This enchantment that is like not changing the nature, but maybe adjusting ourselves to the like very essence of the nature, because we are adjusted and because we do not actually want to change anything, we are like letting the nature live in a way. Totally different to this, Tolkien calls it possessive kind of mechanical magic. And when talking about then not the fairy land and fairy stories in particular, but about the European culture, we'll call like the history of the 20th century like growing of possessiveness in humans. That there is a will of power or of the will of controlling the nature, creating the technology. He's strongly against like raising factories. About like he in this particular essay he like gives like one big paragraph cursing and about the electric street lamp system that was introduced to in Oxford in 40s, 20th century. She's strongly against it, and somehow there's also there is the there could be found an ecological dimension of spells and enchantments, because there is a parallel, a comparison from spells that like a warlock can cast a fireball and kill like our company, from this kind of magic to the will of short effectively control the nature and put the changes like in the manner of our will. What we want we achieve by a single spell. This could be like described as the technology works, and against the technology there are enchantments that would probably never be an easy way, because we do not cast a fireball on the like car factory to burn it down, because it uses the same mechanics. We just, I don't know what to do. Maybe we no, we shouldn't just run away to the forest and live like elves, but maybe, and what Tolkien, maybe it would be what Tolkien did, just accepted and enjoyed the reality he was living in, actually having a lot of advantages like being safe, well fed, and working with the society, while during the evenings he could venture himself to the fairyland, completely safe, and for the author much more satisfying than changing the reality itself. Yeah, about giving, the time runs so fast, but I wanted to give this like two models of, let's say, spells and enchantments, human magic and elvish magic. I do not say that we humans cannot do any enchantment. We can, but let's compare it, like use this elves and men distinction, and to say that enchantment is elvish and spells are human. And I wanted to ask about different kind of popular movies, books, or computer games. Like, how could you find like any title that can be like explained either in the elvish or in the human way? I can. Yeah, actually, that's funny about the heroes of might and magic then, because this might and magic, and you have might, which is the attack and defense skills, that are like, while here the hero is present during a battle, the attack and defense of all his troops rises by the same amount. While magic is something that I trick. I cast a firebolt, or I cast a slow or haste spell. So actually, using this model or a tool of elvish and men magic from Tolkien's and applying it to the Heroes of Might and Magic saga, we would say that might is the enchantment and magic is the spells then. And there's a lot of like instant Arohomora style magic in the Heroes saga, which is much easier when you want to play a game, because you click and you have the instant effect. But I think that the popularity of this saga is built not on the like easy instant spells, but on this possibility to venture, to travel and wander into the land of fairies, where there are different rules applied to this world, which is a different world from our reality, and which can be limitless also, and you can stay there for long. That's popularity also what Tolkien wrote about traveling to the fairy land is recovering. I mean, recovering from, let's adapt it to like to the 21st century, from too much information, for example, that we are receiving from the external world, which we cannot really interpret, and it's keeping in the mind somehow. If you just dream, you know, the brain is still working and working on and on all the like problems that you've been solving during the last days. While if you consciously venture, though it can be a rash adventure, as Tolkien says in the beginning, you can leave there something. Maybe some worries, maybe additional external information that you do not need anymore. You can leave there something, which can be like a long travel, but you're coming back much lighter, with another like free space in the like operational system for another like quest in the real world then. I still remember that from Magic the Gathering. So yeah, so I guess I wonder like probably the words like get into the language, because if we play Magic, we understand the difference between an instant spell and an enchantment. And also like while understanding this division, I just was wondering, and I was browsing through many like popular pop culture titles, like for example Star Wars. When I looked into the Star Wars saga, what I found is that in the beginning it was very like this intuitive, Taoistic way that feel the power look, and he takes the machinery down and he uses his own eyes without any like artificial stuff, and he hits directly the point that makes the star explode. While in the later like movies that's been produced already to the audience used to playing computer games, nobody played computer games when the first trilogy was released, already like some, what they are like using the force in many ways, like they have this shockwave system, now they're like even projecting the images of their body, everything else, and the strength, this this you know measurable moment strength of the Jedi Knight abilities, it grows up, and it's like growing so much with time. I'm pretty worried that we'll be like short of imagination soon, because I think I have to finish now, though I would like to talk more, but my like basic question or a worry is that with the rise of computer technology and the special effects possibilities, like our graphic cards in our computers, the bigger they are, the better spells, the stronger spells we can perform, and maybe there is less and less spell for the enchantment kind of magic, which would be a pity because I have this psychological feeling that enchantment spells, even if we just read a book and imagine them, can be more relieving for the mind. Its time is over. Yep. Yes, magic is, if we agree that magic is fiction, we should still remember that it is exactly this kind of fiction that people want to have, want to produce and want to receive. What movies and games concerning magic are popular, these movies and games that are using the magic especially in the way that the receivers, then the audience wants to buy. So, and this is strange to me, after experiencing the real school, that we're still buying the schools of magic with this usually books, marks given from the teachers and all the graduation system. It really wonders me. I'm here if you want to continue. And thank you for listening.